Hello guys, today we are going to the movie review. Movie name is Scorned 1994. It couldn't find any information on a movie failed Scorned released in 1994. However, I found a movie titled Scorned released in 1994, but uh, but I couldn't verify its full movie details. If you couldn't provide more information or context about the movie, I'd be happy to help. But I found a movie titled Scorned released in 1996, directed by Mark L. Lester and is starring Richard Burry, Brooke, Tassie, and Lonnie Addison. Here a possible review for that movie. Scorned is a stand-to-movie thriller that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense ride. The movie follows a woman named Family Brokenness who seeks revenge against her cheating husband and his mysteries. The movie's biggest problem is a lack of originality. The plot is tried and directly tell a scorned movie seeking revenge with no real surprise to twist to keep the viewer engaged. The characters are also poorly developed, with Family being one dimensional character driven slowly by her anger and hurt. The acting is also Sugar, with the cast struggling to elevate the mediocre script. Richard Burke's performance as the sitting husband is particularly modern and the acting is also subpar, with the cast struggling. Even the McCord script. Richard Burke's performance as the cheating husband is particularly modern, and Lonnie Anderson's over-the-top portrayal of the mystery, the more overwhelming than menacing. Overall, Scorned is a forgettable and unbreakable thriller that fails also to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful in and intense ride. With its predictable plot, poor character development, and super acting. This movie is best left unwatched. I couldn't find any information on a movie title Scorned released in 1994. However, I found a movie Little Scorned released in 1996, directed by Mark L. Lester and starring Richard Burgi, Brooke Thais, and Lonnie Addison. Here is a possible review for that movie. Scorned 1996. Scorned is a straight-to-video thriller that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense ride. The movie follows a woman named Emily who seeks revenge against her cheating husband after discovering his identity. Emily's world is turned upside down as she descends into a world of madness and violence, determined to make her husband pay for his betrayals. The movie starts off with a lot lot of promise. So seeing Emily descend into darkness and despair, the film's pacing is quick and snappy with a series of intense and suspenseful scenes that keep the viewing engaged. However, as the movie progresses, it becomes increasingly predictable and formulaic, relying on right glitches and overthrust plot twist. One of the biggest problems with Scorned is its weak characters development. Family, the protagonist is a one-dimensional figure with no discriminable motivation or backstory. Her actions are driven slowly by her desire for revenge, and her character is never given any real depth or announced the same. And we said for the supporting characters who are paper thin and lack any real substance, the acting is coordinate is also a major letdown. Protesi, who playing family, has a wooden and unconventional presence on screen. The struggle to convey and real emotions or depth at her performance often come across as stilted and natural. The rest of the cast is equally impressive, with the expectation of Lonnie Addison's who bring a bit of much needed warmth and humanity to the film. Visually Scorned is a letdown. The film's production value are low. Film with a series of drab and uninteresting settings that fail to add any real atmosphere or tension to the story. The cinematography is flat and uneasy, with a series of poorly composed shots that fail to capture the film's intended mood. Overall, Scorned is formidable and unimpressive thriller that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense ride. The film's weak characters development, poor acting, and lackluster production value make it a core to watch, and its predictable and formulaic plot make it feels like a waste of time. Even fans of the genre will find themselves viewing it. Film tried chase and overshot plot twist, rating 2.5 star, it on 5. Recommendation: avoid Scorned unless you are die-hard fan of straight to video thriller. Even then, you may want to give this one a pass. Positive, quick, and snappy pacing, some decent suspenseful skins. Lonely additions bring a bit of warmth and humanity to the film. Negatives: weak characters development, poor acting, lackluster production value, predictable and formulaic plot, trackless and overused plot twist. Scorned 1996 is a notorious narrow-waking and narratives negative night Nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturne. The movie follows the nervous and neurotic of a named family who seeks nuclear revenge against her cheating husband. After discovering its numerous and nefarious infiltrates, Emily world is turned upside down by a nagging sense of nows and nows, including nightmares as she descends into a world of madness, mayhem, and non-stop narrations. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of family, neurotic's nature on non-linear storytelling become increasingly nonsensical and non-coherent, leaving the viewers navel-gazing and onions that make it difficult to navigating the narrative many twists and turns. Despite its numerous narrative missteps and non-chemical appeals, Scorned still managed to nag and needle the viewers with a niggling sense of unseen and non-specified menace to the non-stop totally. And then secrets that fail the movie narratives are noisy and unnecessary that distract from the voice overall impact and narrative nouns. It the end Scorned is a non-stop narrative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense ride. Despite its numerous narrative missteps and non-commercial appeal, the movie still managed to nag and needle viewers' feet with its nagging sense of uneasy and non-specified. Means if you are a fan of nonsensical narratives and non-stop noise, then Scorned may be the movie for you, but for everyone is as it's a non-starter. Narrative notes. The movie's narrative is non-linear and non-sensual, jumping back and forth in time and space without warning of explanations. The protagonist family is an neurotic and nerve humans who become increasingly unhasting as the movie progresses, being unable to pay one's debt insolvent. The study of the function of body psychology, the science of foretelling events by star astrology, government by official and state bureaucracy, an office without any work but a high pay, sinecure, a medicine to counteract the effect of poisons, antidote, an admirer of art, dilettante, collaborating, a man having the quality of woman, effeminate, effeminate, that which cannot be moved, immobile. The study of insect entomology, word for word, verbatim, is to do good to others with no violence, whose meaning is difficult to understand, abstracts, way out for water or steam outlet, want to sleep, insomnia, usual behavior of a social group custom. Uh, the movie features numerous non-secured and non-specified narrative points that distract from the overall impact and narrative nouns. The soundtrack is a noise and obnoxious nuance. Non-comedical appeal that may not be suitable for all audience. Non-recommendations. Avoid Scorned like the black this. Noisy and non-anxious nightmare is a non-start that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense ride. The movie's non-linear narrative and non-specified means make it a non-commercial appeal that's not worth your time or money. If you value your sanity and your sense of native nouns, they stay far away from Scorned. Scorned 1996 is a notorious nerve-wracking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmare. In Nocturne, the movie follows a nervous and neurotic woman named family who seeks unclear revenge against her cheating husband after discovering his numerous and nefarious and infidelic employees' world is turned upside down by a nagging sense of nausea, including nightmares as she scanned into a world for madness, rhythm, and non-stop narrations. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of family neurotic nature, the non-linear story takes on a narrative form that generally focuses on her need for nuclear retributions. Emily's nervous energy is palpable as she navigates the nightmarish world of her down-making, where nothing is as it seems and everything is surely normal. The nuance describes an atmosphere is think with navigating us families narrative is constantly interrupted by nagging thought of identify and a tasky encounter with her husband, numerous promures, whose meaning is difficult to understand as truths way out for water or stream outlet, want to sleep, insomnia. Usual behavior of a social group custom use of male word in place of word required by trust euphemism truck train for being topped by protesters or stopped lovingly curious. A traditional story led to deities myth that which is a big pig like portion, a thing to be corrected in a printed book, curriculum, things taken by robust booty, that which is loin like line, that which is fox like wolfin, that which dog like canine, that which exists partly from other people, independent, that which cannot be perceived by touch, intangible, that which cannot be calculated, incalculable, that which can be rooted out, irradicables. Study of the development of plants and animals from earlier from genealogy as family narratives navigates the nightmarish world for her of her own making the non-stop narrative takes on a nasty from that thoroughly focus on her nervous energy. The nouns of her neurotic nature are expertly woven into the narrative which takes on non-liner from that dominates by negativity. The narrative is narrowly focused on family need for nuclear retribution, which makes for a nervously peace exercise in non-stop narratives. The notorious narrative is a nerve-wracking non-stop nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of suspenseful and intense nightmares nocturne. The movie's narrow focus on Emily neurotic nature make for a narrative that's narrowly focused on non-stop negative, which is a non-stop narrative nightmare that dominate by announced of her nervous nature. The liner story takes a nasty from that's narrowly focus on her need for nuclear distribute, which makes of nervously pitch exercise in non-stop narrations. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of family neurotic nature, the non-stop narrations takes on a narrative from that narrowly focus on her need for nuclear revenge. The nouns of her nervous energy, Eric, and narrowly focus on her need for non-stop retributions. This make for a nervously peace exercise. In non-linear storytelling, the narrative is dominated by negativity as Emily's nervous nature navigates non-stop nightmare of her own making. The notorious narrative is a non-stop nightmare that's narrowly focused on family erotic nature, which make for a needlessly paced exercise in non-linear storytelling. The nouns of her nervous energy are expertly woven into the narrative, which takes on a non-linear form that's dominated by negatives. The Stop narrative is nerve-wracking experience that fails to engage the viewer on narratives left, instead focusing on Emily's narrow need for nuclear retribution. As the narratives navigating the nightmarish world of English on making the non-stop narrative takes on the nasty from that narrowly focus on her nervous energy. The nouns of her neurotic nature are narrowly focused on her need for non-stop retributions, which make for a nervously peace exercise in non-linear storytelling. The non-stop narrations is a nerve-wracking or non-stop nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnes. The notorious narrative is non-stop nightmare that's narrowly focused on Emily's neurotic nature, which makes for a nervously peace exercise in non-linear storytelling. The nouns for her nervously energy are expertly woven into the narrative, which takes on non-linear from that dominated by negativities by non-linear narratives. As she is a nerve-wracking experience that fails to engage the viewer on a narrative level, instead focusing on Emily's narrow need for nuclear tributations as the narrative navigates the dark and nasty notes of Emily's neurotic nature of the non-stop narrations takes on narrative from that narrowly focus on her need for nuclear revenge, the announced of her peace exercise, non-linear storytelling. The non-stop narrations is a nerve-wracking, non-stop nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnism. The study of ocean and their phenomenon, oceanography, study of love, nomology, study of fossils, planet, paleontology, study of ancient things like towns, bridge town, archaeology, study of ancient things like tombs, buried towns, archaeology, strong desire for food, wealth, greed, strong dislike between two persons, antipath, stream flowing into another big river, tributary, stealing from the writing of other, plagiarism, statement that is absolute platitude, that which can be easily believed, credible, that which cannot be put out of or extricate, inextricable, that which cannot be satisfied, unsatisfied, that which cannot be erased or removed, indelible, that which easily be curved without breaking, flexible, lachila, that which cannot be corrupted, incorrupted, ईमानदार, that which cannot be corrupted, incorrupted, to escape from hard realities, escapism, plain math. The system was observed to do progress for reformism. The notorious narrative is non-stop nightmare that narrowly focus on Emily Neurotic's nature, which makes for a nervously spaced exercise is non-linear storytelling. The news of her nervous energy are expertly woven into the narratives, which takes on a non-linear form that's dominated by negatives. The non-stop narrative is a nerve-wracking experience that fails to engage with the viewer on a narrative level, instead focusing on Emily's narrow need or nuclear retributions as the narrative navigates the nightmare world. Family on making the non-linear narrative tags on an nasty that's narrowly focused on her nervous energy. The nouns of her neurotic nature are narrowly focused on her need for non-stop retribution, which takes for nervously peace exercise in non-linear storytelling. Non-stop action is nerve-wracking, non-stop nightmaring that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnes. The notorious narrative is a non-stop nightmare that's narrowly focused on family neurotic nature, which makes for a nervously peace exercise in non-linear storytelling. The nouns of her nervous energy are expertly woven into the narrative, which takes on a non-linear form that's dominated by negativity. The non-stop narratives in a nerve-wracking experience that fails to engage the viewers on a narrative level, instead focusing on family narrow need for nuclear retributions as the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of Emily, a neurotic's nature. The non-stop narrations takes on a narrative form that's narrowly focused on her need for nuclear revenge. The nouns of her nervous energy are narrowly focused on her need for non-stop retribution, which makes for a nervously nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnes. The notorious narrative is a non-stop nightmare that's narrowly focused on Emily neurotic nature, which makes for a nervously peace exercise in non-linear storytelling. The nouns of her nervous energy are expertly woven into the narrative, which takes on a non-linear form that's dominated by negatives. The non-stop narrative is nerve wrecking experience that fails to engage the viewer on a narrative level, instead focusing on Emily's narrow need for nuclear retributions as the narrative navigates the nightmarish world of Emily's own, making the non-stop narrative takes on a tenacity from that narrowly focus on her nervous energy. The nouns of her neurotic nature are narrowly focused on her need for non-stop retribution, which makes for a nervously piece exercise in non-linear storytelling. The non-stop narration is a nervous-wracking non-stop narrative that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish realism. Scorned 1996 Scorned is a notorious nervous-wracking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish prism. The movie follows a nervous and neurotic woman named Emily who seeks nuclear revenge against her cheating husband after discovering his nefarious and nefarious and the film Emily world is turned upside down by a nagging sense of Nusa and Nosa, including nightmares as she descends into a world of madness, mayhem, and non-stop narration. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of Emily's neurotic nature, network of her nervous system are negatively impacted nostalgically is exclusive nightmares and nervous breakdowns. The narrative is future x-rayed by the numerous notes of nightingale nihilism which navel gaze and nitpicks the nouns of neurotic notaries for its non-linear narratives and narrative cohesion. Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and narratives negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturne. The movie's narrations narrated in perspective by the numerous and nagging notes of nihilism which Neville's case and Netflix the nouns of nihilism as the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of Emily neurotic nature. The Nervous teamwork of our nervous system are natively in fact resulting in noxious nightmares and nervous breakdown. The negatives in further extended by the numerous notes of 99 nihilism which never case and nitpicks the nouns of tourism noise and negatively impact the native non-liners natives. In the minds of the natives, negativity, emily nervousness is engaged by the numerous and nagging notes of 19th nihilism with novel gaze and napkins, the nouns of noise narratives. 99 Nightly is reputed by the numerous notes of nihilism, which navel gaze and nitpick the nouns of noise and negative impact. The narrative non-linear narratives, notorious for its non-linear narrative and negligible narrative cohesion. Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and narratives negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnes. The movie narratives negatively in is perspected by the numerous and nagging notes of nihilism which navel is and nitpicks the nouns of noise and negatively impact and narrative nonlinear narratives. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of Emily neurotics nature, the nervous network of her nervous system are negatively impact, rustling in noxious nightmares and nervous breakdowns. The natives as natives negativity is future, future extrable by the numerous node to 90s nihilism which navel gaze and nitpick the nouns of reason and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narrative. In the midst of this narrative, negatively, Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes of 90s nihilism, which navel gaze and nitpicks the nouns of heroism as the narrative nature. People by numerous notes of nihilism, which navel gaze and notorious for its non-linear narratives and negligible narrative cohesivism. Scorned is notorious nerve-wracking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturne. The movie's narrative negative perfected by the numerous and nagging notes of nihilism which navel gaze and nitpicks the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narratives as the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of Emily's erotic nature and the nervous network of her nervous system are negatively impacted, resulting in noxious nightmare and nervous breakdowns. The narrative nighting is a future extravel by the numerous notes to 90s nihilism with navel gaze and nitpicks the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narratives. In the midst of the narrative's negativity, Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes of 90s in nihilism with navel gaze that nitpicks the nouns of heroism annoyed the narration's negativity prefueled by the numerous moods of nihilism with navel gaze and nitpick the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative non-linear narrative notaries for its non-linear narratives and neglectables narrative cohesion. Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmares nocturnes. The movie's narrative fueled by the numerous and nagging notes to nihilism which never gives the nitpick the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative non-linear narratives. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of Emily Newby's nature, the nervous network of her nervous system are negatively impacted, resulting in noxious nightmares and nervous breakdowns. The negative is virtue extracted by the numerous notes to 90s nihilism, which navel gaze the nitpin the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narratives, non-linear narratives. In the midst of his narratives, negative Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes of 90s nihilism which never gaze and nitpicking the nouns of heroism nor the spiritual negativity is prepared by the numerous notes of nihilism which never gaze and nitpick the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narratives, non-linear narratives, notorious for its non-linear narratives and intangible narrative cohesion. Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnes. The movie's narration narrative is perfected by the numerous and nagging notes to nihilism, which navel gaze and nitpicking the nouns of nourish and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narrative. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of family's neurotic nature, the nervous network of her nervous system are negatively impacted, resulting in noxious nightmares and nervous breakdown. The narrative's negative in further accentuate the image's notes to 90 lines nihilism which never gaze and nitpick the nouns of heroism, noise, and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narratives. In the midst of narratives, negative Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous nagging notes of 99 nihilism with revel cage and nitpicking the nouns of no reason why the narrative nature negative is prepared by the numerous notes to nihilism which navel cage and nitpick the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative. Non-linear narrative, notorious for its non-linear narrative and negligible narrative cohesion. Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and narrative indicating nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturne. The movie narrative negatives is prepared by the numerous and nagging notes of nihilism which navigate and nitpick the nouns of reason and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narrative. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of Emily neurotransmitters, the nervous network of our nervous system are negatively impact rustling is noxious, nightmares, and nervous breakdowns. The narratives nativity in the future accelerate by the numerous notes to nightingaleism which navel gaze and nitpicking the nouns neurism and negatively impact narrative non-linear narrative. In the midst of this narrative natively, Emily nervous capture the narrative by the numerous and negative notes to night nihilism which reveal case and nitpicking by the nouns of heroism by the negative narrative negatively is prepared by the numerous notes of nihilism with navel gaze and nitpicking the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative non-linear narratives notorious for its non-linear narrative and negligible narrative cohesive. Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmare. The movie's narrative narratively is prepared by the numerous and nagging notes of nihilism which navel gaze and nitpicking the nouns of noirish noir and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narrative. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty notes of Emily's hectic nature of the nearest network of the nervous system are negatively impacted, resulting in noxious nightmares and nervous nods to nine times nihilism with navel gaze and speaking the nouns of heroism noise and negatively impact the narrative law and the narrative in the midst of this narrative negativity Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes to nice feelings which navigate the nitpicking the nouns of heroism nor the negatives is prepared by the numerous notes of nihilism which never is and nitpick the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative non-liners narrative notorious for its non-liner narratives and negative cohesion. Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and narrative negatives nightmare that fails to discovery on and its numerous of suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnes. The movie's narrative negatively is fueled by the numerous and nagging notes of nihilism which navigates and nitpicking the mass of values and negatively impact narrative non-liners narratives as the narrative negate the dark and nasty nouns of Emily's neurotic nature. The nervous network of the nervous system are negatively impact wrestling in a noxious nightmare and nervous breakdown. The narrative negative its pressure exploited by the numerous notes to 90s nihilism which navigates and cherry-pick the nouns of knowledge and negatively impact the narrative non-liners narrative. In the midst of the narrative negativity, Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes to a 90s nihilism which navigates and nitpicking the nouns of heroism where the narrative nature negative is perfected by the numerous notes to nihilism which navigates nitpicking nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative non-linear narrative. Notorious for its non-linear narrative and intelligible narrative cohesion, Scorned is notorious, nerve-wracking, and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturne. The movie narrative negatively is prepared by the numerous and nagging notes of nihilism which navigates and nitpicking the nouns of nihilism and negatively impact the narratives non-liners narratives as the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of English neurotic nature of the nervous network of our nervous system and negatively impact wrestling in noxious nightmare are nervous breakdowns and narrative negativity in approaches extrapolated by the numerous notes to anti-analism which navigates and nitpicking the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative non-violence narrative. In the midst of this narrative negativity, English nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes of nineties nihilism which navigates the and nitpicking the nouns of heroism and narratives. Negatively is prepared by the numerous notes or to nihilism which navel-gaze and nitpicking the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative non-linear narrative. Notorious for its non-linear narrative and negligible narrative cohesion, Scorned is a notorious nervous-wracking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnes. The movie's narrative negativity is propelled by the numerous and nagging notes of nihilism, which never gets between the nouns of noise and negatively impact the narrative non-linear narrative. In the midst of the narrative negatively Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes of nine times nihilism based navigates and between the nouns of nourish the narrative's nature. Negative is prepared by the numerous notes to wait, which navigates and between the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the negatives non-linear narratives notorious for its non-linear narrative and mentalism nature cohesion. Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmares nocturnes. The movie's narrative nightmare is prepared by the numerous and nagging notes or to nihilism which navigates with the nouns of noise and negatively impact the narrative non-linear narrative. As the narrative negates the dark and tasty nouns of Emily's neurotic nature, the nervous network of her nervous system are negatively impacted, resulting in noxious nightmare and nervous breakdown. The narrative negatively is further exacerbated by the numerous notes to nine ties nihilism with navel gaze and jet begin the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narratives, the online narratives. In the midst of his narrative negativity, Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes to nineties nihilism with navel gaze and nitpicking the nouns of noirism, the narrative negativity is prepared by the numerous notes to nihilism with navel gaze and nitpick the nouns of noir and negatively impact the narrative non-linear narrative. Notorious for its non-linear narrative and intelligible narrative cohesion, Scorned is a notorious nerve-wracking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturne. Movie's narrative is prepared by the numerous and nagging notes to nihilism which never gaze at nitpicking the nouns of noise and negatively impact the narrative's neither narrative. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of English neurotic nature. The nervous network of our nervous system are negatively impacted, resulting in noxious nightmares and nervous breakdown. The negative is further exacerbated by the numerous notes to nine-type nihilisms, which navigates and nitpick the nouns of noise and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narrative. In the midst of this narrative negatively, this nervous nature is negated by the numerous and nagging mode notes it nine types in nihilism, which navigates by between the note of nihilism or the narrative. Narrative negative is prepared by the numerous notes to nihilism, which navigates and nitpick the nouns of noise and negatively impact the narrative. Non-linear narratives, notorious for its non-linear narratives, negligible narrative cohesion. Scorned is notorious nerve-wracking and narrative's negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmare. Doctors, the movie's narration nightmare is prepared by the numerous and nagging notes to nihilism, which navigates and nitpicking the nourish and negatively impact the narrative. Non-linear narrative as the narrative navigates the dark and testy nouns of ambiguous nature. The nervous network of our nervous system are negatively affected, resulting in noxious nightmares and nervous breakdown. The narratives at it further exacerbated by the numerous notes to nine nihilism, which navel gaze and nitpick the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative. In the midst of this narrative negativity, the nervous nature is navigated by numerous and nagging to nine types nihilism, which navel gaze and nitpicking the nouns of nervous noise. The narrative's negativity is prepared by the numerous notes to nihilism, which navel gaze and nagging notes to nine types nihilism, which navel gaze and nitpicking nouns of noise. The narrative negativity is prepared by the numerous notes to nihilism, which navel gaze and nitpicking the nouns of noise and negativity impact the narratives. Non-linear narratives, notorious for its non-linear narrative and negligible narrative cohesion. Scorned is notorious nerve-wracking and narrative's negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturne. The movie's narrative negativity is prepared by numerous and nagging notes to nihilism, which navel gaze and nitpick the nouns of heroism and negatively impact the narrative's non-linear narratives. As the narrative navigates the dark and nasty nouns of English erotic nature, the nervous network of her nervous system are negatively impacted, resulting in noxious nightmare are nervous breakdown. The narrative negativity was exacerbated by the numerous notes to nightize nihilism with naval case and neptic the nouns of realism and negatively impact narrative non-linear narratives. In the midst of this narrative, negatively Emily's nervous nature is navigated by the numerous and nagging notes to nine dice nihilism with naval case and nitpicking the nouns of Iris, the narrative nature negativity is prepared by the numerous notes to nihilism with navel gaze and nitpicking the notes of realisms and negatively impact the narratives non-linear narratives. Scorned is notorious nervous wrecking and narrative negative nightmare that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmare nocturne. The movie follows a nervous and neurotic woman named Emily's two-week nuclear revenge against a city husband after discovering his numerous and nefarious identities. Emily's world is turned upside down by nagging sense of nausea and nausea, including nightmare as the descent into a world of madness, mayhem, and non-stop narrations. As the narration navigates the dark and nasty nouns of Emily, neurotic nature and the nasty nouns of her neurons are naturally negated by the numerous and nagging nightmares, nihilisms, nightmare that Emily faces is not just a moral nightmare, but the nasty and non-stop narratives of nasty neurotics, the non-stop Emily's neurotic nightmares, neurotics are nasty and neurotic nature, making her a naturally nasty and non-stop nature of tasty nature. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its numerous and nagging marathon prose, including a never-ending and nightmarish narrative that never navigates the nouns of Emily's erotic nature. The nasty and non-stop narration of the movie's narrative is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious influence of Emily's cheating husband, who is never named in the movie's narrative. This nasty and non-stop narration naturally nurture the narrative nasty and nihilism nature, making it a notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturnes as the narrative navigates the nouns of Emily. Neurotic nature is naturally nervous down to the nasty and non-stop narration of nightmare. The narrative nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the humorous and nagging like fears that we face, making it a never-ending and nightmarish narration of mistrust and notorious the nasty and non-stop. The song of the movie's Neptune is a natural result of the narrative nasty and nihilism nature, making it a notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturnes despite its numerous and nagging narrative flaws. Scorned is notable notorious movies that is notable for its never-ending and nightmarish narrative of nostalgia and notarism, the nasty and non-stop narration by the of the movies, which naturally negated the non-stop waking nightmarish nocturne. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its numerous and narrative flaws, including a never-ending and nightmarish narrative that navigates the nouns of English neurotic nature, the nasty and non-stop narration of the movie is natural negated by the numerous and nefarious non-stop narrative naturally nurtures the nature and nihilism nature, making it notorious and nervous wrecking nightmares nocturne narrative negativity. The narratives of Scorned is notable for its numerous narrative negatives, including never-ending and nightmarish narratives, nasty and non-stop narration, nefarious and numerous and deathless singing, and nasty night fears, natural and nihilistic narratives, notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturnes. As she notes, the movie narrative is notable for its numerous and nagging narrative flaws, the nasty and non-stop narrations of the movie's narrative is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious identifieds of Emily's sitting husband. This nasty and non-stop narrative naturally nurtured the narrative nasty and nihilism nature, making it a notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturne. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its numerous and nagging narrative flaws, including a never-ending and nightmarish narrative that never navigates the nouns non-cynical narration. The narration of Scorned is notable for its non-sensual and non-stop narrations, which naturally nurtures the narration nasty is nihilistic nature, the tasty and non-stop nature of the movies is a natural result of the narrative nasty and nostalgic nature, making it notorious and wrecking nightmares nocturne. The narrative nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nagging night fears that the family face, making it a never-ending and nightmarish narrative of pestilence and notorious narrative. Now, the narrative of Scorned is notable for its announced and nasty action which naturally navigates the nouns of Emily erotic natures, the nasty and stop nation. The movie nature is a natural result of the narrative nasty and nihilistic nature, making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturne. The narrative nocturne nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious identify of Emily's uh, sitting husband, who is never named in the movie narrative. The nightmarish nature. The narrative of Scorned is nightmares nocturnes, a notorious and nerve-wracking night of nasalize, not notorious, the nasty and non-stop narrations of the movie's narrative is a natural result of the narrative. Nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the numerous nefarious identities of Emily, setting husband who is never named in the movie's narratives, narrations negate and nonsense. The narratives of Scorned is notable for its numerous narrative negated by the announced, including never-ending nightmarish narratives, nasty and non-stop narratives, nefarious, numerous, identities, negative, nagging and nasty, night fears, natural and nihilistic, native, notorious and nerve-wracking, nightmarish, nocturne, announced and nasty narratives, natural and nasty, narration, notarious and non-stop narration, natural narratives, and narrative of Scorned is a natural narrative, a nasty nihilistic narrative that naturally navigates the nouns of Emily Newry's nature, the nasty and non-stop narrations of the movie's narratives is a natural result of the narrative's nasty and nihilistic nature, making it a notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturne. Narrative nocturnal nature is naturally negated. The nouns of Emily's neurotic nature, the nasty and non-stop nature of the movie narrative is as a result of the narrative nasty and nihilistic nature, making it a notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturnes. The narrative's nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious infidelity cheating husband who is never named in the movie's narrator's nightmares nocturne. The narrative of Scorned is a nightmarish nocturne, notorious and nerve-wracking night of nostalgia and narratives, the nasty and non-stop narration of the movie's narratives is a natural result of the narration. Nocturnal nature is natural negated by the humorous and nefarious intent of Emily's cheating husband who is never named in the movie's narration negating the narrative. Scorned is notable for its numerous narrative negative including never-ending nightmares, narrative nasty and non-stop narrative nefarious and numerous identified negative and nasty night fears natural and nihilistic notarious and nerve-wracking nightmares nocturnes natural and nihilistic. The narrative of Scorned is a natural and nihilistic narrative, a nasty and non-stop nation that naturally navigates the nouns of English neurotic nature, the nasty and the non-stop narration of the movie's narration is a natural result of the narration, nasty and nihilistic nature making it notorious nerve-wracking nightmares nocturnes. The nervous nocturne nature is a nature negated by the numerous and nefarious navigating of Emily's setting husband who is never named in the movie's ratios, nouns and negatives. The narrative Scorned is notable for its nouns and narrative ways actually navigating the natural result of the narrative nasty and nihilistic nature making it a notorious and nerve-wracking nightmares nocturnes. The narrative nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious indifference of Emily, sitting husband who is never named in the movie's narrative. Nightmare is nocturne is narrative nouns. Notorious, the nasty, the non-stop movies narrations is a natural result of the narrative nasty and nihilistic nature making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturne. The narrative nocturne nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious identities of Emily's leading husband who is never named in the movie's narrative negative and nouns. The narrative Scorned is notable for its numerous narrative negative and nouns including never-ending and nightmarish narratives. Nasty and non-stop nefarious and numerous and implies making and nasty night fears natural and nihilistic nature notarious and nerve-wracking nightmares nocturnes and nasty narration natural and nasty narrations notarious and non-stop narrations nasty and nihilistic. Listen, the narrative of Scorned is a nasty and nihilistic nation, a natural and non-stop nation that naturally navigating nouns of Emily neurotic nature, the nasty and non-stop narrations of the movie's nation is a natural result of the narration's nasty and realistic nature, making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmares nocturne. The narrative nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious identity of Emily's sitting husband who is never named in woman's narrative natural and nihilistic narrative nouns. The narratives Cornish is notable for its nouns and nasty native nouns which naturally negated the nouns of English. Neurotic nature, the nasty non-stop narration of the movies. Native is a natural result of the narrative's nasty and nihilistic nature, making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmares nocturnes. The narrative nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the numerous and various identities of English setting husband who is never named in the movie's narrative nouns and the negatives. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its nouns and nasty native nouns which naturally navigate the nouns of English neurotic nature, the nasty and non-stop narration of the movie's narration is a natural result of the narrative nasty and nihilistic nature, making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmares. Nocturne, the narrative nocturnal nature is notoriously neglected by the numerous and nefarious interplay of English setting husband who is never named in the movie's narrative. Natural narrative negatives. The natural narrative of Scorned is notable for its various negatives, including never-ending and nightmarish narrative, nasty and non-stop narrations, nefarious and numerous in-flights, nagging and nasty night fears, natural and nihilistic narrations, notorious and nerve-wracking nightmares, nocturnes, narrative nouns and natural narratives. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its nouns and natural narratives, nouns which naturally navigating the nouns of English erotic nature, the nasty and non-stop narration of the movie's narrative is a natural result of the native and nasty and nihilistic nature, making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturnes. The narrative nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious infidelity of English setting husband who is never named in the movie's ratio. The negative of Scorned is nightmarish nocturnes, notorious nerve-wracking night of the slides. The native of Scorned is nightmarish nocturne is notable at nerve-wracking night nestlines. The native nestly is nihilistic nature, making it mysterious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturnes. Native nocturne nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious influence of Emily's setting husband who is never named in the with narrative negatives announced. The native of Scorned is notable for its numerous narrative negative and nouns including never-ending and nightmarish narratives, nasty and non-stop narrations, nefarious and numerous infidelity, nagging and nasty night fears, natural and nihilistic narrations, notorious and never-working nightmarish nocturnes, nouns and nasty narrations, natural and nasty, notorious and non-stop narration. Scorn is a notorious nerve-wracking and negative nightmares that fails to deliver on its promise of a suspenseful and intense nightmarish nocturnes. The movie follows a nervous and neurotic woman-named family protagonist who seeks nuclear revenge against her cheating husband after discovering his numerous and nefarious indefinite family world is turned upside of madness, making and non-stop narrations. To escape from hard reality, escapism, the system which is observed to do progress for reformism, temple dedicated to all the god pantheon, talk the brine and reputation of somebody's scandal, the study of population demography, the study of physical phenomena of lakes, limnology, spreading by infections, infectism, and as a narrative of Scorned is notable for its named in the movie narration, the taste, nasty and non-stop narrations naturally nature the narratives nasty and nihilism nature making it notorious as the narration navigates the nouns of Emily's neurotic nature. It naturally narrows down to the nasty and non-stop narrations of the night mass. The narrative nocturnal nature is naturally dictated by the numerous and nagging night fears that Emily face, making it never-ending and nightmares narratives to of lateness and notorious the nasty and non-stop narration of the movie nation is a natural result of the narrative's nasty and nihilistic nature of making it a notorious and a nervous-wracking nightmarish nocturne. Despite its numerous and nagging native flaws, Scorned is a notable and notorious movie that is notable for its never-ending and nightmarish native of Nestorans and notorious the nasty and non-stop narrations of movie generation is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious end-of-flights of implicating husband who is never named in the movie's narration. This nasty and non-stop narration natural reassuring the narrative and nasty and nihilistic nature making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturnes. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its numerous and nightmarish flaws, including a nervous ending for and non-stop narrations and of the movie narration is naturally negated by the numerous and inferiors influence of Emily's naturally of a native tasty and nihilistic nature, making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmares. Nocturne's narrative nightmares. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its numerous narrative, including never-ending and nightmarish narrations, tasty and non-stop narrations, various numerous infinity nagging and nasty night fears, natural and realistic narrations, notorious and never waking nightmarish nocturne, nasty noise and nihilism, nefarious, erotic and nefarious narration, mumbling, nightmares and hanging serve necessary notes. The movie narrative is notable for its numerous and nagging that flows. The nasty and non-stop narrating of the movie's narratives is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious infidelites family setting husband. This nasty and non-stop narrations naturally neutral is native nasty and nihilistic nature, making it notorious and nerve-wracking nightmares nocturnes. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its numerous and nagging narrative flaws, including never-ending nightmares, narrative and that never navigates the nouns family, neurotic nature, the nasty and non-stop narrations of the movies is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious indifferent of family setting husband who is never named in the movie's narrative. This nasty and non-stop narrations naturally nurtured narratively nasty and nihilistic nature, making it an hilarious and nerve-wracking nightmarish nocturne. Non-sequel narrations. The narrations of Scorned is notable for its non-sensual and non-stop narrations, which naturally of nurture and the nasty and nihilistic nature. The nasty and non-stop narration of the movie's narrative is a natural result of the nasty and nihilistic nature, making it a notorious and never-breaking nightmare. Nocturne, the natural is naturally negated by the numerous and nagging night fears that the face, making it a never-ending and nightmares narratives of nastiness of notarious narrative nonsense. The narrative of Scornet is notable for its nouns and nasty narrative which naturally navigates the nouns of family, erotic nature, the nasty, and the non-stop narrations of the movie narrative is a natural result of the narrative's nasty and nihilistic nature, making it notorious and nervous-wracking nightmarish nocturne. The narrative is nocturnal nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious influence of family setting husband who is never named in the movie's narrations nightmarish nurture. The narrative of Scorned is signiferous nocturnes is notorious and nerve waking night of nastiness and notorious nasty and non-stop narration is a natural result of the narrative is tasty and nihilistic nature making it notorious and never breaking nightmares. Nocturne's narrative, Nocturne's nature is naturally negated by the numerous and nefarious influence of families. Certain husband who is never named in the movie's nature, narrative negations. The narrative of Scorned is notable for its numerous narrative negations, including never-ending and nightmarish narratives, nasty and non-stop narrations, nefarious and numerous, infidious, negative and nasty, night fears, natural and nationalistic, notorious and nerve-wracking, nightmarish, nocturnes, nose and nasty narrations, natural and nasty narrations, notorious and non-stop narrations, natural narrations. The nation of Scorned is a natural. Okay guys, thank you, टाटा बाय बाय गुड बाय, कल मिलते हैं, आज के लिए इतना ही.